Eye on Gauteng, brought to you by the Gauteng Department of Economic Development.
Hello and a warm welcome to Eye on Gauteng. My name is Lionel Skink. Thanks for joining us. On this episode, we're talking housing, and in particular, mixed housing. The Cosmo City is a mega housing project some 25 kilometers from the Joburg CBD. It's the flagship housing solution to turn around segregationist planning that was synonymous with South Africa's apartheid past. On this episode, we ask these questions. Can mixed housing such as Cosmo City provide affordable solutions to new home seekers? And can it provide decent proximity to economic opportunities for its residents? Now, joining us in studio to discuss this is the director at Urban Dynamics, Jean-Luc Limacher, Executive Director, Basil Read Developments, Mr. Yusuf Patel, and the Director and Development Manager for Cosmo City, Mr. Mulherron. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
I think the first place to start, if you look at Cosmo City, the history of Cosmo City is that it was there to actually be a solution to informal settlements that had just developed in the area. I think it was Zevenfontein and Riverbend, I stand to be corrected. But now let's talk about the phenomena of informal settlements. Jean-Luc, in France there's informal settlements. Clearly South Africa is not the only country with that problem. How big a problem is it, and is it a problem?
I think it's a problem because remember, in terms of our constitution, we need to provide proper shelters to our community, as well access to healthy and safe environment. And obviously, an informal settlement, by definition, does not meet this requirement of the constitution. Therefore, it is a problem. However, you will find sometimes that informal settlement gives you some clue of your housing solution because people know best where to go in terms of relation to their employment opportunity or social relationship they've established themselves with their surrounding community. And sometimes we forget that we need to sometimes to listen to the people, and we cannot just plan or blueprint planning. It's important that we take the existing situation into consideration, and I think that was one of the benefits of Cosmo City at the beginning. When Cosmo City was launched, they went through quite a drastic planning process of identifying the land where informal settlement could be accommodated. Unfortunately, Cosmo City didn't have any informal settlement in situ because the land was privately owned by a bank and a private landowner. But at the time when the planning process was done, then the demand was identified for housing in the northern part of the other area of so-called Randburg municipality, or that's called the Northern Metropolitan Local Council. And at that stage, the demand had to meet, or let's say the supply had to meet the demand. And that's where Cosmo City came into action.
All right, we're talking informal settlements before we go more deeply into Cosmo City itself. Yusuf, informal settlements, squatter camps, shacks, whatever you want to call it, is always at, there's always a fight between themselves and the forces of law and residents. It's like a bad sight. So, it doesn't look good, doesn't look pretty. In your assessment, why are squatter camps or informal settlements a problem?
Well, Lionel, maybe we need to take it a step back a bit and understand the phenomenon. If you take a province like Gauteng, this province is faced with a huge amount of urbanization, a high level of urbanization. And I think that's why government as a whole is responding through the National Development Plan, where there's a clear focus on saying, how do we provide decent shelter to all our communities, taking into account that we're a growing country, our economy is growing, our population is growing, and we have high levels of urbanization. So a province like Gauteng is faced with people coming into this province looking for economic opportunities, job opportunities. They may not always get it, but they perceive better opportunities. And we can't wish that away. What we need to do now is actually say, how do we really look at doing serious long-term planning and begin to plan new settlements? You're going to need developments like Cosmo City. You're going to need numbers of them to be erupting up, to be able to accommodate.
But would you say that when people settle illegally on a piece of land, they are actually sending out a message to whoever the forces, the powers that be, that actually this is where we would like to live. We'd like to live close to, like what Jean-Luc was saying.
Absolutely.
I agree. I think we must be careful. Informal settlement is not taking place by chance. It's a process where it takes place. Otherwise, you will have found people sitting on or invading or locating themselves on all the vacant place in Gauteng. And you will find informal settlement are very dense and located in certain area. And normally it's based firstly on the ownership of the land. Very often you'll find that invasion take place on public land
Okay.
Okay. Because public has an obligation to provide alternative to that community. Two, you will find maybe that the land is owned by somebody which is not in South Africa, or is it an estate? Some people have left us. And you will find that on that land, there's no management or nobody is looking after it.
Right.
Therefore, the informal settlement will be well informed. People in informals are very well informed of where to go and how to go about it.
Let's get Brian in here. Okay, Brian, it is true that the Cosmo City was done, or at least established as partly as an answer to people that didn't have formal housing, those areas I spoke about. Would you say that informal settlements are a nuisance?
I wouldn't say they're a nuisance. I think it's they need to be addressed. I think what Jean-Luc and Yusuf were pretty much suggesting, they don't just pop up for the sake of just popping up. They pop up for a reason, and I think the reason for it is the mass in numbers can force government to actually do something about it. And
because these people, where were they living before?
Look, from Cosmo City perspective, the bulk of the community, or the beneficiary community there, come from Zevenfontein. There's probably about 4,600 families that come from Zevenfontein, which, as you know, is right next to Dainfern. The remaining people came from a settlement called River Bend. That was, as Jean-Luc was saying again, also strategic. That was public land. And the remaining few came from Cosmo City Farm itself.
Okay. Now let's talk about urban planning, and we have urban planning expert Jean-Luc with us here. And of course, Yusuf. In fact, all of you. Let me not get it, let me get that correct. Jean-Luc, urban planning in South Africa, we all know, apartheid said, look, the rich will live here, and they happen to be of a certain...
Not only the rich, it was race-based, no more than income-based.
Right,
Yeah.
Okay, today it's
income-based.
basically based on how much money you have,
Yes.
but it was all based on race,
Yes.
and obviously that was an untenable situation. Group areas was, but from where you're standing, how big a problem has that been to overturn?
Okay. Firstly, there is mechanisms have been put in place to try to redesign our cities and turn them around and make area which were not accessible before accessible now. I mean, through public transport, through private transport, but also bringing other type of land use. One of the big problems we had, beside the segregation, the race segregation between white and black, was also that this area, the townships, if we can call it that way, were not provided with all the amenity that a normal city will have. Not only your schooling and parks and so forth, but also your job opportunity. You will find that most of the industrial area were not located in the municipality. So for the first thing we try to do is to turn around and create opportunity. Obviously, if you look at Soweto today and Soweto 30 years ago, it's completely different. Soweto 30 years ago was far from any opportunity. Today, Soweto is not that badly located. However, we need to turn around, and you'll see the investment which are starting to respond to the provision of infrastructure by government. People investing, new shopping centers being created, industrial zone being, and obviously the opening up by putting more motorways, try to ensure that the trains and taxis and buses are also functioning properly. This will make Soweto not something which is outside the urban core. It will be inside the urban core.
Right, now, Yusuf, obviously as an urban planner yourself, you work for a private sector company, Basil Read, and you were instrumental in the development of Cosmo City together with Brian. Do you think the private sector in South Africa today understand the imperative of doing away with apartheid-style urban planning?
I think, Lionel, they do. But the challenge is quite a vast challenge, because you're talking of, the legacy of apartheid spatial planning has left us with a huge, huge problem. Most of our communities and the poorest of the poor often live furthest away from job opportunities, etc. We don't have adequate transportation systems, so the cost to travel and move around the city is extremely high. In fact, our cities in South Africa are some of the most inefficient cities in the world. If you look at from a density point of view, from a mobility point of view, they're highly, highly inefficient. So we've got a lot of work to do. And government is responding, but the challenge is so vast. We're going to need serious public-private partnerships, because the resources of government alone are not going to be able to address this challenge. I think the private sector can play a much bigger role, and I think that bigger role is going to come from a realization, both on the part of government and the private sector, that the challenge is going to grow as we speak, because in government's National Development Plan that was released by the National Planning Commission, I think it's still in draft version, but if you look at there's a whole chapter on sustainable human settlements. And the argument there is that by 2030, we're going to have an additional almost 8 million new people living in our cities in South Africa. Now, what that really means, Lionel, is that we're going to have to duplicate the whole of Johannesburg and eThekwini as metropolitan areas. We're going to have to duplicate that in less than 20 years' time.
Wow.
Now, when you think about it in that way,
Then you understand
then the challenge of, the kind of bulk infrastructure we need, because that's the kind of stuff that's holding up development now. We need bulk infrastructure at a massive scale. We need proper spatial planning, land use management systems. We need to identify suitable located land. And we're going to need interventions across greenfield developments, where you have developments like Cosmo City, you build them from the scratch. We're going to need inner city interventions, infill interventions, make our cities more compact, etc. But then when you go for higher densities, it becomes even more costly, etc.
Okay, I think we've understood from both of your answers that the problems are immense and almost insurmountable. But then here comes along Cosmo City, a breath of fresh air. It's a brand new concept almost from 2004, and people from different financial, cultural, and social backgrounds been put together, the rich together with the poor. I've been there myself. I've been told, Brian, that you can find somebody living next door to their helper, their domestic helper, in the same settlement, and so on. But do you think that is really been so successful, Brian?
Cosmo City, absolutely. When we actually started the implementation of Cosmo City, I think right across the board we were all worried. It was a whole new concept in South Africa, obviously the biggest of the type of development within the country. We've been developing Cosmo City for just over 6 years now, and if you look at the size of it being 12,500 housing units, we're 95% complete.
Okay.
And that's across the salary spectrums. As far as the economy in that it's concerned, or the private market, we've got shopping centres up there, we've got private clinics, we've got churches. The park facilities are actually fantastic. Education, we've got 7 schools up and running in Cosmo. In fact, we can't get them up quick enough. So to develop 12,500 units in 6 years is some going. And the bulk of that is the private sector.
I'd just like to know, because everybody talks about the mixed income. Have we been able to answer the mixed race? Are we able to have different races in Cosmo City?
Look, within Cosmo City there are different races. It's predominantly black, but there's Indian colour, there's white. In fact, we were talking about just before we came on to the show here, there's actually 2 white people that are beneficiaries in the RDP area.
Okay. All right. On that beneficial note, we're going to take a break and come back and talk more about housing, mixed housing in particular, on Eye on Gauteng. Stay tuned.